Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Aaron Toulouse, founder of Promotable, and also your host for this Breaking into Data session. Great to see a lot of familiar faces, so thanks for coming back. Before we get started, a couple of quick announcements. First of all, thanks for staying and coming again. I know it sounds trivial, but you have no idea how good it feels when I can see that people are talking, meeting new people, before the event starts. All this kind of stuff is like really cool, and so we want to keep it going. But that said, I know there's lots of other places that you could be and lots of other fun webinars to go to. So I definitely do appreciate it. So with that said, of course, in these events, we invite data experts and business leaders to share their expertise, so you guys can learn, network, get actionable tips and techniques to move your careers forward. And of course, we also offer virtual live online training programs for those of you that want to take the next step in becoming promotable, specifically in data science. So our Data Science Accelerator, I mentioned it before, however, it's in partnership with 1871. So it's an income share agreement-based, live online, full-time immersive program, and our goal is to close that gap between learning and landing your first job. Certificates are cool, but that's not what gets you hired. And so we start with top-notch instructors, and when I say that, I mean our lead instructor is a senior data science director at Anthem. So we bring in top people who do this every single day and know what it takes to actually be successful. Of course, we have a board of mentors, so rather than having one-on-one mentorship, which you'll meet with them one-on-one. But the important thing is, you don't just want one person. You want someone who knows what it's like to work at hard tech companies, someone who works at e-commerce tech companies, someone who works at small Series A versus Fortune 500. We bring that together so you know what you're looking for and what that might look like. And of course, we try and connect the dots even further. We throw out the passion project. That's something you should be working on the side. But we connect you with our industry partners so that you've actually got real experience working at a real company. And of course, we all back that up with our job guarantee and income share agreement. So if you're curious, want to learn more, go to learndata.co. Our next cohort, rather, will be starting in September. With that, I'd love to introduce Hallie Moldawar, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, but probably will. Feel free to correct me. But this is a really exciting program. So she is an insights manager over at LinkedIn, and I think we talk a lot about, and Hallie's going to dive into it, but there's like data collection, data prep, analysis, and then insights. What the hell does that mean? And so with that, we're going to hand it over to Hallie and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Aaron. So my name is Hallie Moldauer, and as he said, I'm a program manager within our Insights org over at LinkedIn. So I'll be talking a little bit about my experience today, what my career path to LinkedIn and into this role looked like. What is the Insights function at LinkedIn? Where do we sit in the organization? What's our mission? What type of tools do we use? And what do we look for when looking to hire insights analysts or insights program managers?
Awesome. And then, folks, so we're gonna have a little conversation, and then while we're talking, please put your questions in the question section, or also go ahead and raise your hand. And then, once you're ready, we'll go ahead and start calling you, either inviting you to the stage, or also we can just moderate the question and kind of go back and forth. But I think just to kind of jump in, I think there's kind of two directions I want to take this conversation. One, kind of talk about a little bit more what you just started talking about, which is, what are insights? How does that differ? Because we throw these words out all the time, right? Data is really important. Data is the new oil. Insights are really important. Ultimately, companies care about, how do I turn this information into more money? But kind of what does that process look like? And then also, I want to dive into kind of your career track, because you weren't always a data person necessarily, but you have like a really interesting background. I think you were in product for a while, and kind of now you're kind of moving more towards that insights track, which I think is somewhere in the middle. But I'd love to, I think for a lot of folks here who are kind of thinking, what's next? I want to do data stuff, but I don't want to become a data scientist. What does that mean? I think you're probably one of the better people to talk about that kind of thing.
Great. So I think I'll start with just a little bit of my career path and how I got here, and then I can start explaining a little bit about LinkedIn and the Insights org, and what that means in terms of the difference between insights and analytics and data science and really everything in between. So for me, when I graduated from undergrad, I had majored in biopsychology, neuroscience, and global health, like completely unrelated to anything that I do right now. I mean, I can really stretch it. I can stretch it to say that, with neuroscience, I really studied about like the way that people make decisions and like behaviors, and like now I use data. There's a long path.
I did political science and tech, so
yeah, it's nothing, but it was
nothing practical
that I got out of my undergrad for my job now. And so, but when I graduated, I was really interested in healthcare and healthcare management and the business side of healthcare. And so the first two companies that I worked for out of undergrad were healthcare software companies. And it was really by accident that I ended up in software and technology companies in the first place. I'd originally been looking for something more related to management consulting, but I ended up finding my first job with a company that did healthcare software. And so I spent then the first about 5.5 years working in the healthcare software space. And so when I first started out, I was implementing software. So I was leading implementations for a software that helped hospitals figure out what their costs were. So it was doing a bunch of things related to the finance space for hospitals and budgeting. And so I was working, directly one-on-one with customers and implementing the software. And so this was really the first exposure that I got to SQL and anything data related. But at that time, it was really integrating data. It was integrating data from other health systems into our systems to be able to then do some, calculations and analysis on using our programs to get them the, actual insights and the output that they needed. And so from there, I eventually ended up moving into product management within that company. And so this was kind of the first time I would say. So I did this shift twice. A shift of being like very much client focused, working one-on-one with clients, solving their problems, figuring out what their needs were, to moving into a role where I had to start thinking about all of our clients, all of our customers, and what was going to benefit, the majority and what they needed the most. And so this like shift in prioritization, I went through it once when I was at Strata, and then again more recently in my role at LinkedIn. And so I became a product manager then for the product that I had previously implemented, and had gone from that shift of like figuring out how do I make this work for this one client? How do I get them exactly what they want versus having to prioritize across all of our clients and making the best decision for the company as a whole. And so one of the questions that I get a lot then is why, if you were a product manager, like why did you go back to being why did you move then into being a data analyst, of being an insights analyst? A lot of people are like, wait, like you were already a product manager, like why would you?
You already have the cool job. Why?
Yeah, like isn't that what most people are like aiming for eventually?
Yeah.
And for me, when I started looking for a new job, I was definitely looking for the right company, so that was part of it. And I was really open to anything. I was looking at all sorts of roles, just like in Chicago, and seeing like what tech companies were there, what was available. And this role of an insights analyst was something that I had never really heard of. And, I thought of it was a role that was kind of a juxtaposition between sales and data science and product management. Like it kind of fit in a lot of different areas, and I felt like it didn't require maybe the rigorous requirements that we see sometimes for data science. That there wasn't like a long list of like tools or technologies and things that I needed to have, and the skills that they were looking for an insights analyst were, it was a base of technical skills of being able to use something like SQL to manipulate data. But a lot of it was more on the communication side, being able to explain data to other people, stakeholder management. There were a lot of other skills that I had from my previous experience that were translatable to an insights role.
Yeah, that's super interesting because, I mean, you kind of nail on the head, which is like why leave product, because everyone seems to love product. But I think part of it's just like looking for a new challenge, right? Something that's interesting. But tell me a little bit more about the stakeholder part, because we throw it around a lot. Like I talk about it all the time. I'm like, who's your stakeholder? But like it's very, very different. Like it could be a team, it could be C-suite, it could be like a boss, and it could just be like a customer. Is there like differences in like how like you have to, or like what do you primarily interact with, and like how do you go about if working with those stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think that's where I'll explain a little bit about where the Insights org sits in LinkedIn to explain who our stakeholders are. So the way that LinkedIn is structured, and so one of the questions I actually get a lot is how does LinkedIn make money? Is it all off of our premium subscriptions? Is it from that like whatever $75 a month that people pay? And it isn't. The majority of the LinkedIn revenue really comes from the corporate relationships and corporate contracts. And so companies pay LinkedIn for, it's really 5 different products. It's Talent Solutions, which is a recruiting product, Sales Navigator, Marketing Solutions to put ads out there, LinkedIn Learning, and Glint, which is an employee experience platform. At the end of the day, they're all different ways of visualizing and leveraging LinkedIn data for different purposes. And so we're organized across these different lines of business. And then the Insights team actually sits within our global sales organization. And so this is one of the differences I would say about Insights versus some of the other teams that do analytics at LinkedIn is that we're actually part of the sales organization. And so our team's mission is to really unlock the value of LinkedIn data to fuel and drive partnerships with our clients, with organizations. And so we're really using data to, prove the value of the LinkedIn platform, improve the value that our customers get from their LinkedIn investments, and to help our sales organization and our customer success organization elevate the conversations that they have with our customers based on the insights that we can provide from the LinkedIn data. And so I wanted to explain that a little bit just to frame who our stakeholders are, because that means that our stakeholders are kind of both our customers and sales reps and like customer success managers. So there's a bit of the internal stakeholders and the ultimate external stakeholders of our customers.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's actually super interesting because people do ask, I'm curious, right? How do you guys make money? And yeah, as someone who has paid for the corporate services, and I know how expensive those are, yeah. Sometimes I'm like, wait, how much for
your
that?
premium product?
It's the only product on the market that does what it does. So it's like you have monopoly.
I feel like Mark Zuckerberg sometimes when when he was asked by Congress, being like, so how does Facebook make money? And he's like, ads.
It's like you are the product.
Yeah.
No, but it's look, at the end of the day, like that's how all these things work. One thing that's curious to me, because I think like in the data space, I think like the skills you need sometimes like change pretty rapidly, especially like and from a couple of years ago, and like what's kind of hot for you. Like what was like the most important thing for you like when you first kind of got into that insights role, and looking at it now, is there something that like people need more of? Like, do you need to be more technical than maybe 3 years ago, or is it less technical? Is there something like what's like the secret sauce for being on the insight side of things?
I would say one of the changes that I've seen is I feel like, especially in our team, especially in the Insights org at LinkedIn, statistics has become more of a skill set and a focus than I felt like it was when I was first hired a couple of years ago. It's something that I feel like statistics and anything related to scaling insights. These were things that might have been nice to have a couple of years ago, but now there's just there's a much higher focus on statistical rigor and being able to scale things and not just kind of producing things one-off. So that's definitely become a bigger focus in the past couple of years.
That makes sense. And like, would you say like primarily these are like folks who have more like SQL backgrounds and more technical backgrounds, or is it folks who may have been like marketers who then you guys are hiring saying, hey, you seem teachable, like go learn SQL or go learn Python or whatever it is that you guys expect them to know?
Yeah, so our insights organization is split up into two types of insights roles. Mm-hmm. So we have insights analysts who are more client facing and who do more of the custom insights. Mm-hmm. And for that was the team that I first came on when I started at LinkedIn. And for this team, a lot of people came from consulting backgrounds, actually.
Yeah,
there was like a mix. There's a lot of people who came from consulting backgrounds who just knew how to, take a problem, figure out a solution, manage stakeholders. There were some people who came from analytics. I would say like within the LinkedIn marketing business, marketing background is obviously more valuable there.
Yeah.
Just because there's so much, industry knowledge specific to marketing.
Yeah.
But then the other team, which is the team that I sit on now, we're considered like the tools and programs organization. And we're really focused on insights at scale and insights products. And so there's definitely more technical skills needed, I would say, as a base for the tools and programs versus like the client facing insights analyst team. In the base skill, I would say across the board is definitely SQL, but we also, like when I was on the client-facing team, we had hired several people on our team who came in without SQL experience and learned it on the job. We felt like they had enough of the other types of skills and experiences that we were looking for that were like, we can teach them SQL, like that's not a big deal.
Yeah. The way I see it, like someone who can problem solve, if you know Excel, like if you've taught yourself Excel really well, it's just like, I don't want to say easier, but it's like just Excel at scale. I'm sure someone who's like a data scientist here in the audience is gonna like kill me for that answer. But welcome to the pragmatist. But yeah, so now like we've kind of danced around a little bit, but from your angle, tell me about what you think the difference is, or maybe you can define them for us between analytics and like insights. What's the difference between like something that is like, hey, we found this information, this is something that's cool, versus this is something that's insightful for the business?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot, especially working within a sales organization. And there's sometimes, you work with stakeholders, sales reps, or other client-facing teams that it's just they're looking sometimes for data for the sake of data. They just want to fill a deck with information for a client that just has tons and tons of data in it, data for the sake of data, or like a really cool visualization. And, we find a lot of times that like having so much data and just choosing things for the sake of having it, at best, you end up with something that maybe is mildly interesting. And at worst, you end up with something that's like completely overwhelming. And so being able, like, I remember this was something that was really an evolution for me from when I first started, where sometimes I would just I would just kind of spit out the data and just be like, okay, well, here's what it was. Here's what, here's what the numbers were, et cetera, et cetera. And then, I would get a response from someone and they'd be like, okay, so what? Like, what do I do with this? Okay, great. Like, these are the numbers, but what does this mean? Like, what type of, like the insights that really come down to, it's something that's going to reveal something that like the client didn't know before, or it's going to start a conversation about something new or a different direction they could be going into, or it's going to help them to inform a decision. Because just giving numbers, like, a client might come to us and say that they're interested in opening up a new office somewhere. And maybe we'll look at different hiring trends data, et cetera, and we could present to them and just, give them across the board, here are all of the open roles and here's what the demand looks like in all of these different places. And it's really like that, so what, that like final recommendation that, okay, so based on this analysis that we did, we recommend that you consider opening an office, within this region because it's got people with the skills that you're looking for. These are those skills, like the demand isn't as high, like there's not as much competition. Here's what the, like the average salary ranges are. There's like a lot of things that you can give, but there's gotta be a so what to it. Like, what is someone going to do with this information?
Why are we here? Yeah, that's like it leads me to the next question, but that's like something that's so common. I never understood how common it was, but like, you're totally right. Like a lot of times, like you'll hear people say, we need to get smarter about data. We need to collect more. And then they end up with just this like massive tech debt and no way to actually do anything with this stuff that they think is an asset, but really is a liability.
It's also, like, I would say too, from like the role I'm in now, like a big piece of it is enablement as well. Like you can build a really great Tableau dashboard that like looks awesome and has lots of great visualizations or like some really cool tool. But a big piece of it is the enablement strategy and making sure that people know that it exists and that it's solving the problems that people actually need it to solve. That it's answering the questions that they need to have answered. Because I've seen a lot of things created too that are just cool. Yeah. And, and they might just be interesting, but they're not actually they're not solving a problem for anyone.
They haven't gone through the work of actually asking your users, what do you care about? What is like the thing that like you hate doing, and how can I fix that? We had about a month ago, 2 months ago, we had a talk from someone who literally was like, it was about user analytics, but it was just about this. It was like, it's like, oh, our metrics seem great, everything's going well. And I'm like, why are we getting all these complaints? And then it's like, oh, we made a bunch of stuff that is cool, but no one cares about.
Or no one knows exists. That's also the worst part too.
That's
it's just like common. No one even knows that this, that it's out there and like how to use it.
Oh yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, when I think of like, because we have data classes, right? And so every now and then I'll talk to someone and say, oh, what does your company offer? And they'll say, I know I have something, but I have no idea. And I'm like, and then you find someone else and you're like, oh yeah, we spend like this much money with like on whatever kinds of products they have. And I'm like, yeah, or even, a lot of people, I'm like, don't spend it on our classes. I'm like, but I'm sure in your, like as part of your comp, you get like $2,000 a year to go spend on something. Like, don't leave free money on the table. That's usually what I think about it. But that kind of leads into my next question, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. What are the things that, because I think like you always think like, oh man, if I knew that, I would have been so much better at my past job or whatever. Like, is there something that during the last like couple of years that you've picked up that you're like, man, this would have been pretty straightforward. I really wish that I learned it either in school or in like your past job.
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the things that I learned is that it can be helpful to have like a basic understanding or knowledge of certain technologies going into a job if you know you're going to use them. But there's only so much you can learn until you have a practical application for it. And so I felt like that was something that, sometimes coming into a role, especially even the role that I'm in now, that I was kind of overwhelmed by like the number of new technologies, the number of new programs and things that I was going to have to use. And I was like, well, should I have spent all this time like before starting the job, teaching them to myself or learning it? And honestly, there's like to a certain extent, I was like, not really. It was a lot easier to learn it in the context of how I needed to do it for my job. And I feel like that translation is sometimes so hard to create in a classroom unless you're, applying it to like an actual problem. Because I think back to even, I just finished up my MBA at Kellogg a couple months ago, and I had done, like business analytics courses there. And it was always emphasized that like you had to think about what the actual business problem was, but there was there was only so much of that you could really simulate in like homework problems or, group work, like things like that I was able to apply. So it's like, I feel like the basics were helpful. So like, definitely understanding statistics and having, a basic understanding of how things like, how to use R, was helpful. But once I got into my actual role, it just clicked a lot more once I had the problem in front of me and was like, okay, so how do I use these, these tools that I've learned to use in the classroom and now apply it to like this actual problem I have at hand.
Yeah. I'm chuckling because not because of you, but like I probably did like half an MBA at Georgetown, and I took a class just like this. It was called Strategic Business Analytics, and it was well, let's just say the person said, we're going to learn about big data. This was like 5 years ago, so not that long ago. He pulls out this like Excel spreadsheet, 100,000 rows or whatever. It was like totally breaking, nested pivot tables. But this is like the stuff that like basically everyone was there to like prep to do like consulting interviews or whatever. And it's like, yeah, I see that. And I'm like, I'm really good at using goal-seek. It's like my favorite Excel function, but like put me somewhere else and I have no idea what to do. Because it's like there's only so many times I can figure out the pricing for, was our homework, like a minor league hockey team, like, and you just make up answers.
Right. It's also like making sure that like if you're going to take a class in something, that the technology that they're using in the course is going to be relevant. It's still relevant, like in the world today, or like
yeah. Well, this particular professor, was if you remember Arthur Anderson, like he was senior there. And has been teaching ever since. So, he's been out of the game for like 25 years. Don't get me wrong. Like, nice guy, can teach. But like, I was asked that question of like, what do you wish like someone taught you? Because like, I wish he just canceled the class and spent 10 minutes showing me Tableau.
Yeah.
Because like,
and that's interesting too. Because, I took a data visualization class last summer, and It was actually good because it had a bit of a Tableau tutorial, but it expected you to do some of the basics on your own. And then the rest of the class was really focused on like, okay, so how do you actually create meaningful visualizations? Like, what are the principles to creating a visualization that's useful? Because I think that there's some things that you're not going to get your MBA to have them teach you how to use, to use like a particular programmer tool. Like you can do that on your own, but it's more figuring out like how do you connect this to the business applications.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just, MBAs are MBAs, right? There's really good things about them. If you don't know what you're doing, there's potentially an opportunity to be wasteful. But we're just looking at some of the questions here. Merrick just asked to talk about your transition from healthcare to where you're at now. Are the data challenges similar, or is it? I have some insight into healthcare, and it's a total disaster on the data side. But I'm also curious about this. And then for everyone else, go ahead, guys, and throw your questions. There should be on the side a little question section. Please don't put your questions into the chat because they're going to get lost, and there's a good chance that I'm not going to see them. Or you can also raise your hand, and you can share your screen, and we can all see you, and then you can ask the question yourself as well.
Yeah, so what I see as like the primary challenge when it comes to data in healthcare is disparate systems. And this still exists, in other industries too, but especially within healthcare, I found that it was just like so many disparate systems that didn't talk to each other. And so that was part of like what I was doing in my old role was we were integrating data from, a bunch of different systems and trying to bring it together. And there was a lot of like data cleaning and stuff that had to happen as part of that. In my role now at LinkedIn, I'll admit there were some things I was definitely surprised by when I got there. When I first started being like, I'm going to like a large tech company, like they will definitely have all of their shit together and like the data will be like nice and clean and like easy to find and there'll be a source of truth and I'll know exactly where to go. And I just don't think that's the case anywhere. I feel like I'm not naive anymore, and I've realized that just isn't necessarily reality. And I think that we still have, it's not as much. It's all coming now at this point. Like I feel like all the data is coming from all of our own systems, but they're still coming from different systems. Like you're still having some of those, some of the same types of integration issues. But I found that for me, like transitioning at least from healthcare into like the internet or like the tech industry, it wasn't so much about like my industry specific experience. And I think that's definitely true for like tech in general, is that they're not necessarily looking for like tech experience. They are more interested in other types of industries and other type of experiences and what you can bring, what you learned from there into tech. Because I feel like I really worked with people who'd had a variety of different backgrounds and experiences and worked with different types of data and had, different perspectives on how to use data. And that was really helpful.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I would say the same thing. And what you're talking about, like with like just different systems with different data and no source of truth. I also assume that when you're at like a big tech company that you don't have like loose Google Sheets everywhere, which I'm sure you guys probably it's not that bad. But I remember when my first startup, and this is like multi-million dollars in revenue, like not small, right? And they had like a custom backend which they built, and then they like. Imagine, like, I remember we had to integrate DocuSign, and I was like, how hard could this possibly be? It's a $20 a month like product. Why is this so hard? And it was just like, that's what you get for not getting something off the shelf. But it was like, and I see that at scale, and I'm like, that definitely speaks to me.
I think it sometimes gets harder too. Like the larger the company, the more data, the more people touching it, the more people generating it. Like there's a lot of different places where things can.
Yeah, well, especially with that, like, LinkedIn's huge, right? And then Microsoft's bigger, so it's like you've got like, I assume it's like different teams have different things that they use, or different like org or units within the org, right? So it's like, I imagine that makes it worse.
Yeah, the one thing is that there definitely has been a strategy over the past year of One LinkedIn of trying to get everybody onto the same type. It's getting people onto the same types of tools. Yeah, because there was definitely a transition from that. Still felt like it hadn't been 100% completed since the Microsoft acquisition, where people were still used to using like different Google tools and stuff. And we're like, all right, guys, it's been a couple years now.
Yeah, we should probably
SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, like, come on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially like with like any sort of like M&A activity, like you see, it's really bad when when I talk to anyone who's in finance, because they're like, oh, we've acquired these like 13 banks, and they each have these like they'll say they use like computer languages like I've never heard of, which like tells me it's like super old, and they're like it's really expensive because there's like one person left who can do this, and so just pay them as much money as they want, and they kind of move on. But it's like all that tech debt you never really deal with. But Sukai asked a question about what's the difference between being an analyst and a manager. I think that's actually an interesting question, because I feel like first-time managers are like, it's always such a challenge to go from like not doing it. I mean, but obviously you have like the different experience, so.
Yeah, so I did the difference too is, so I was a people manager at my previous company when I was managing implementations, and I was managing like a team of consultants, but now I'm a program manager, and so I'm not directly managing anyone. I'm more managing like a suite of tools and programs that kind of like sit within those tools. And so my job as like a program manager differs from like the job of like an analyst. So I could explain that difference a little bit, but it's not exactly the same as like analyst versus we have people managers within Insights too.
Yeah. Well, here's a question so I at least for my friends in product, I understand that Microsoft's like product managers and program managers are kind of like interchangeable, or at least from like you're like a program manager at Microsoft is like equivalent to like a product manager elsewhere. Is that like the same thing at LinkedIn? I'm asking just given that you were in product, so kind of
most of the time, no. And so I would say that the exception is there are a couple products that LinkedIn has developed that came from the Insights org that started as something that Insights analysts created custom. So if you've heard of LinkedIn Talent Insights or recently launched LinkedIn Sales Insights, these were products that were based off of reports that the Insights team had created and were delivering to customers that were eventually turned into a product. And so there are a couple there were a couple of program managers from Insights who really played like a product management role in creating those products. Yeah. But I would say the difference is, at least within Insights, so for program managers, in my job, like I manage tools that sit on an internal platform that deliver insights at scale to our sales reps and customer success managers. And so I'm managing, tools that create PowerPoints for them at scale with, customized data, dashboards that give insights at scale. So developing those types of products. But I would say at LinkedIn, like product managers are really the ones who are developing like the products that make up the LinkedIn platform and the LinkedIn products.
Got it. Makes total sense. Another question from Gili. Sorry, I'm totally butchering your name. I apologize. He asked, what's the value of insights that are driven from quantitative data versus insights driven from qualitative data? And then more specifically, how do you incorporate qualitative data into the work that you do?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because I think especially within using insights for sales purposes or like with customers, there's the quantitative data and qualitative data can be equally important. And so one example that I think about is when we're trying to prove the ROI on a particular product. Like we are able to look at, so our Sales Navigator product is something that salespeople use to find leads and connect with potential buyers and get insights on them, et cetera. And so we can directly sync with the CRM data, a client CRM data, and be able to say, okay, like LinkedIn Sales Navigator influenced this percentage of your revenue. It influenced this many deals. Like when your sales reps used LinkedIn versus they didn't use LinkedIn, like this is what their win rate looks like. And that's all great. Like it's great to have that like hard ROI data and being able to actually sync with a customer CRM to be able to do that. But there's a lot of scenarios where maybe a customer isn't syncing their CRM and we've got to find other ways to prove ROI. or just having like more anecdotal and qualitative feedback can help really like bring that story to life. And so I see this a lot of times too, where we'll show the data of these are all the actions that like a sales rep took on LinkedIn to close this deal. They saved all these leads, they sent all these in-mails, like all this stuff. But then what really brings it home is, if we're able to get any sort of qualitative data too from someone who said like, yeah, this is what helped me do it. Like I was able to get this conversation with this person, which they told me this, and like this is how I signed the deal. And so a lot of times if we're able to kind of combine that type of qualitative data and more anecdotal with the quantitative data, it can make for a much stronger story. And I think the qualitative data is sometimes what can really like humanize the data too, or humanize the story, or make it relatable.
Yeah, well, I think it also adds that context. I think what you're talking about is like super key, because if someone can say like actually, because like I think oftentimes like the instinct in the data space is to just like throw a bunch of numbers at you, and kind of say like, oh, can't you see it's because of this? But it's actually, you see it all the time where it's like sometimes, and this is where like when I talk about the difference between like insights and analytics, like I'll say like I'll talk about like someone's, I don't know, sales information, right? And they'll say, oh well, like we have a problem. Sales are down in Q4, and I'm like, well, if you're in retail and you're down in Q4, that's a big problem. But if you're not in retail, maybe that's like normal for your industry, right? And if you don't have that information, that's not necessarily quantitative. I mean, it could be, but it's also just like understanding your space.
Yeah. I think like the context is so important.
But yeah, okay, guys. Let's see. I'm sure I've gotten these three. We'll hang out for a few more minutes. Here we go. Got a hand. Elena. Here we go. Hi, Elena. Oh, did we lose Elena? She's back? Hello? This is where you make a Bueller joke.
Yeah, can't hear me.
I will let someone get that. Oh, hello. Hi, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm in Texas, so the internet is still kind of choppy, I guess. I don't know. It's still weirded out. But no, I just wanted to ask, like, I don't know if anyone's asked this yet, but like I just graduated from a data analyst immersion program. So I don't know. I think it was kind of difficult for me to draw insights from the data, like in a way to basically portray to someone else. I understood it myself, but I guess I wanted to ask what is like the hardest thing about gathering insights from the data or information that you have?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you brought up a really good point, is sometimes like translating it to other people or other business leaders can be really difficult. I think it's sometimes, like as insights analysts or as data people, like we can do an analysis and it all makes a lot of sense to us, and we get these final results and we're like, yeah, like look at this is the lift or this is the change. These were statistically significant. And then it's like, how do you translate that to something that is actually relevant for the business? And it's a challenge, and I think it involves knowing what you're trying to solve for in the first place. Like, what were the goals that you were setting out, and what does the audience care about? I'm actually going through this experience tomorrow in a meeting where I'm taking like a pretty like detailed analysis that I did and having to present it to like our senior leadership team to say like, okay, so we did this analysis. This is how I, explained it at a high level of what we did with enough detail that they care about, versus like, if I'm explaining this to someone on the data science team, I'm going to go through and be like, all right, here are all of the t-tests that I ran and the p-values and like the statistical significance and all of this stuff. And just knowing that for this audience, like they don't care about that. They want to know at the end of the day, like, what do these results mean? What are we able to do now that we couldn't do before because we did this work? And I think that that's probably like one of the big questions to ask when trying to translate data to insights is like, what did we not know before that we know now? What decision can we make that we couldn't have made before?
Yeah, exactly. And then also like to your point, like, and does this actually make us more money or like have some sort of like positive business impact? But I think what you're also bringing up, Elena, that I think is like one of the challenges in like doing any sort of training, right, is connecting it to like the real world. And you can have like, there's lots of like exercises, but like for me, the question is like, because we had someone a couple months ago from Roku talking about just questions. How do you ask a data-driven question? Because to me, we're talking about like, you know, like it's less like how to find these insights, and it's because then you can ask, well, what's the problem we're looking to solve, right? And if they say we want to increase revenue, then you can say, is it because you want someone with higher margin? Do you want to, you know, juice growth numbers? Do you want like, you know, you can be more specific where you can't ask like a textbook that question. So anyway, but thanks, Elena. Let's move on to the next question.
I was just gonna say it could be hard too if you're not familiar, like if this isn't your job and you're not super familiar with the data, because I remember too, like even for my interview with LinkedIn, I was given a data set and asked to to create a PowerPoint deck off of it, analyze the data, and come up with some insights. And I was like, I've never seen this data before in my life. I don't know what this product does. And I feel like doing that research of understanding, I mean, that's something too, like understand whatever product or service that you're working on and what the goal of it ultimately is. What is the value prop? Like, what is the value prop of this product or service? And that can always be done too if you're given like a take-home assignment for an interview and they give you some data. Like you can do, you have the time to do that type of research to figure out how do I frame this with the appropriate context of the value prop of this product or this company. Yeah. And not just numbers. And I think that's what really that's what, sets you apart in those situations, is not just churning out numbers that, without the added context of the business problem.
Yeah, no, it's really, I mean, at least from like an interview perspective, it's like, did you do the work to like, did you go, or did you say, okay, like, let me give you this, but did you go out and try and figure out, okay, well, I know what the biggest pain points in this industry are, and then you can kind of, and obviously like, look, they know that you don't know everything about the industry. Right. And I think that's like one thing that trips people out, but is what it is. So Richard had just asked if you could talk a little bit about trend analysis and time frames for valid assumptions. I'm not sure. Richard, do you want to raise your hand? So because I'm sure I'm not explaining your question correctly. There we go.
Come on, let me see, where is it? Hold on, there it is. Okay, it's one thing to collect a lot of data, it's another to interpret the data, and it's another to play the data out over time, so you're not making assumptions on what you believe to be the case, but what the data is telling you. So I'm always interested in how you do trend analysis. What's a valid assumption based on the trends? How do you determine the validity of the data or the trends that the data is sharing before you start investing money in something that truly wasn't represented in the data, but you interpret it as such? Is that clear?
Yeah, and I think that's especially relevant in this past year. Like, I feel like that's been something that we've had to pay attention to a lot, because there's obviously been trends like as a result of COVID, and like thinking even specifically to LinkedIn, we've seen skyrocketing usage and engagement on the platform because of COVID. And so, it's like taking those trends into account of, what's been going on this year, and whether which trends we think are here to stay and which ones we think are going to be different, because we can't make all of our decisions based on what we've seen over the past year. And so I think it's a combination, at least for right now, of looking at trends in the past year, but also comparing to years prior, as well as part of that is looking for, we think for some things that I think the trends that we've seen in this past year are going to be relevant, at least for the foreseeable future, but we know that not everything will be. And so having to look year over year is also really important, and not just focusing on the past year alone.
Yeah. No, is it something a one-off, or is it, I think of like, for me, it's kind of funny, but like, it's like, I don't know, thinking about the toilet paper that was purchased this year. Like, we're probably not going to see that again every single week.
I would say we look for a lot of seasonality too. Like, we know that there are some trends, with LinkedIn data and hiring, we know that a lot of people change jobs in January. Like, there's things like that we can see year over year that might be a little wonky, I would say, comparing data from 2020. But we do try to look at comparisons too, of taking seasons and different trends that we see coming at different times of year into account as well. And so there could be like a lot of times we see maybe drop off in activity in December for salespeople, that we're taking that into account and we're doing kind of month over month. I think that helps for it as well. If you look at things like quarter over quarter, month over month, rather than just year over year.
Yeah, and then of course,
micro versus macro data analysis, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And then like what things have changed, right? That like if the trend is kind of like there are things that COVID accelerated, but what didn't necessarily start, right? Like we just discovered Amazon, but we all use it a lot more now.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. There we go. And then after this, we've got time for a couple more questions. And then here we go. From Merrick asked, the best advice you can give to someone who is new to working with data and just programming languages in general. And I know you're not like a software engineer, but maybe you can speak to SQL or R or like just kind of jumping into something like that.
I think it's understanding the basics, like making sure you understand what's happening, like when you're not just learning the commands and the queries, but making sure you understand, like able to visualize what you're doing to the data and understanding what changes you're making or not making, really understanding like the basic functions. And I don't think that you need to necessarily, like I think like with SQL, you can start with you can have a pretty basic understanding and figure it out as you go along what you need to do. I think that you don't necessarily have to, know everything up front. It's like knowing enough to be dangerous and then, knowing how to figure out a problem when it comes up. There are so many resources available, whether it's, looking things up online or using, attending a boot camp or a course or LinkedIn learning courses. There's just a lot of different resources that you can use to figure out, like to fill your gaps. And so I think that's part of it too, is just not, I think that some of the advice that I would give is that, don't be afraid to like apply for an opportunity because you don't have all of the skills listed. Don't like just because they list like a bunch of different tools or technologies that they're looking for in this role. I would take that with a grain of salt and really interpret it as they're looking for people to solve problems and they're hoping that you have a couple of tools at your disposal that you're able to solve them with. And even if it's not the same tools that they use at their organization, if you already have a basic understanding of one or two of them, then, chances are you're going to be able to learn a new program or a new tool and be able to apply it. And so I just wouldn't get discouraged by, lists of requirements or a list of specific tools. I think that depending on the company or depending on the industry, there might be a couple basic things that you want to make sure you know going into it. But you don't need to know it all. And I just wouldn't have that hold you back from applying for something because you can't check all the boxes.
Oh yeah, I can speak to that. I mean, definitely. I mean, HR people just copy paste job descriptions, and they don't really spend much time to say, oh, this is 3 years or 5 years or whatever, right? But one thing you can do that is surprisingly effective, and I'm sure people say this all the time, but honestly, reach out to people on LinkedIn who have similar jobs like that, because you can just ask, and don't ask them for a job, obviously, but just say, hey, I'm applying for these kinds of roles. They have this laundry list of requirements. Are all these super important, or which ones are nice to haves? And honestly, I don't know, maybe it's just a Chicago thing, but you'll be surprised by, at least I was, by how many people actually respond to you and spend a lot of time, more than you would expect.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend reaching out to people. I always say that how I ended up at LinkedIn was a LinkedIn inception story, that I was on LinkedIn looking for jobs, saw the insights role that existed at LinkedIn. And then I reached out to someone on LinkedIn that I knew, and if not for LinkedIn, I wouldn't have known that they had worked in this job. It was just a whole inception of things, of reaching out to someone and asking for because I wasn't sure either when I first looked at the role, of being what is this role actually like? Do you think I have the skills that need it? And when people reach out to me, I'm always happy to help answer those questions too. The one recommendation I would make too, if you are reaching out to people, is to have a job or something in mind. And it's especially helpful if you're able to provide a link and say hey, I'm thinking about this role. Can you tell me more about it or connect me to someone who can? or what type of skills. I think sometimes it's a little harder if someone comes to you being like, I'm just interested in a job at LinkedIn, and you're like, okay, like what kind of job?
Those like, I mean, I get those. I'm never going to reply. It's like that's like one of the things that like you wish you actually understood. Like people tell you these things, but then like you don't really understand why until you're doing it, and you're like, oh, that's why.
Yeah, I just think people can be a lot more helpful. Like I feel like I can be a lot more helpful when people send me, like if they tell me roles that they're interested in, then I can do a little more research and say like, yeah, this is where I can see where this role sits in the organization. I can see if I know anyone who's, on that team or connected, versus like a more general like, I'm just like do some research up front. That's kind of what you can come with the question of like, what's the difference? I see a role listed in data science and I see a role listed in insights. Like, can you help like explain a little bit like what the difference between these are?
Well, that would really show that you've put in some effort, right? I think that's part of the biggest part. I mean, part of it's like a more specific like ask makes it a lot easier to actually give a better answer, but also
that's what it is for me. I don't really, like if I'm not hiring for, I don't really care how much effort you're putting into it per se. I just want to be able to like point people in the right direction and give them an answer that's like actually going to be helpful.
Yeah, not like a generic like, please visit our careers page.
Yeah, and I had to do that before. People have reached out and been like, oh, I was like, okay, well, take a look at the job. Like, let me know if there's something you're particularly interested in.
Yeah, then I'm like, why did you bother replying? But now I know, because now I'm like, now I'm that asshole. So, it just is what it is. But the last question of the night is kind of come from, I'm not going to say this name because I'm sorry, I'm just going to butcher it. But she's currently applying for entry-level data insights, analyst roles, self-taught. And you kind of touched on it a little bit, but is asking recommendations or resources for how to put together a good project or like how to like put together a portfolio and like what would make that stand out. And then before you answer, I'm also going to say that we actually have an event on this exact topic in 2 weeks. So definitely sign up for that. She's from Walmart. I talked to her probably for like a half hour about random different projects, but it's always good to have multiple perspectives. So what do you think, Hallie?
Yeah, so I would say like it's definitely, at least in my experience, like it hasn't been a requirement to necessarily have like a portfolio, but I could definitely see it being, maybe more relevant for an entry level job if you don't have previous experience of being able to show like, that, like that you have the skills that you're saying that you have or that you think you're a good fit for the role. Like if there are any projects that you've done in school, like I think, that could be a good opportunity to showcase something like that and maybe take it a step further than whatever the project was that you had to make it more relevant to the new opportunities that you're applying for. There's also just like there's a lot of options online in terms of like data sets that you could look at and come up with something interesting. I would also, if like Tableau is like a skill that you're interested in and want to showcase, like Tableau has a lot of options of different things that you can do. And I've seen like a lot of examples of people who've created Tableau resumes, or Tableau sometimes will gives public access to different data sets and can help like walk you through creating different types of visualizations. So something like that could be worth exploring too, of seeing what you can do. What you can do is like a data set that's publicly available and maybe something that you're particularly interested in, you care about. Mm-hmm. I would even recommend that over something that like that's necessarily relevant to a particular company. Because if you choose some type of data set or problem that you're just interested in, whether it's relevant to the company or not, that's something that you could use in your portfolio, like regardless of the company that you're applying for, and be able to speak to with like a lot of knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, and companies like to see people who are curious and can because that shows that you can actually solve a problem that's outside of the box without much guidance. But one example I will give, this person actually was a speaker. I threw him in the chat about 6 months ago or so. He has like a good example of this kind of thing. He's a person who loves sports. I'm sure there's lots of folks who might be like hardcore baseball fans or football fans. And so, I mean, his is exit velocity over expected something else. Basically, is trying to figure out if you can come up and say I want to figure out why teams win and make some sort of correlation. You come up with the basics, right? You have a question, you have a methodology, and you can show actual insights, right? And they're not just random, but you've done the work, you get the structure, and also it's something that's unique. No one wants to see a Titanic data set. Everyone does it, but it's not going to help you stand out. But something that's either interesting to you or relevant to like the companies you're targeting, I think is always a good first step. And yeah, I mean, GitHub, Medium, if you haven't read Towards Data Science, that's just one spot to look for examples. And honestly, like same thing, reach out to folks who are kind of at places you're looking at and just ask them to say, hey, like what do you think is good? And or ask honestly, like someone who has a manager title, because they might say, these are the ones that I just like skim over and don't really matter, and like this is what is interesting to me, and then do that like 10 times. Because then we to go back to being good at statistics, right? You don't want to have sample error. So now everyone knows I'm a nerd. So I'm going to end it with that. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Please join us at the tables. We'll be happy to chat one-on-one. If anyone has any questions about the Data Science Bootcamp, feel free to come say hello or just come say hello anyway, because I always enjoy connecting with everyone. Thanks, Hallie. This has been really good. I think everyone got a lot of good questions answered. I know I appreciate it. It takes a lot of time to kind of do these things and take the time out of your day and eat late. So always appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome.